What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected actors sits down for what should be a routine morning interview, only to discover he's just walked into an ambush broadcast live to millions? It only took 38 seconds. 38 seconds for a single sentence to shift the temperature of an entire studio. 38 seconds for polite smiles to crack. 38 seconds for Good Morning America to transform from a polished morning show into something raw, tense, and dangerously unpredictable. The studio lights were already blazing before dawn. Those oversized panels hanging from the rafters cast a soft but artificial warmth across the set, bathing everything in that familiar golden glow America associates with comfort. The massive curved desk gleamed beneath the brightness. Monitors flickered. Floor managers whispered cues into headsets. The faint hum of production equipment filled the background like a steady mechanical heartbeat. Outside, Times Square was just waking up. Inside Studio 44, everything was already in motion. Robin Roberts stood near the desk, reviewing notes with the kind of calm professionalism that comes from decades in front of a camera. Michael Strahan leaned back in his chair, relaxed, adjusting his cufflinks with casual ease. And at the center sat George Stephanopoulos, composed, polished, flipping through his stack of interview cards with quiet concentration. This was supposed to be easy. A standard promotional appearance. Samuel L. Jackson was coming in to talk about his latest film, another high-profile project from a man whose face had defined modern cinema for 3 decades. The booking was solid. The ratings would be steady. Nothing controversial. Nothing complicated. At least, that was the plan. The stage manager's voice echoed softly across the floor. 30 seconds. The audience, a carefully selected group of early risers and tourists clutching coffee cups, adjusted in their seats. They were excited. Samuel L. Jackson wasn't just a movie star. He was presence. He was gravity. He was one of those rare figures who didn't enter a room, he claimed it. And then he did. He walked onto the set with measured confidence. Dark suit. Crisp shirt. Glasses catching the light. His expression carried that unmistakable Samuel L. Jackson blend of calm authority and restrained intensity. The audience erupted in applause, louder than usual for a morning segment. He smiled, not wide, not exaggerated, just enough to acknowledge the respect. Handshakes were exchanged. Robin greeted him warmly, her smile genuine. Michael stood and clasped his hand firmly, nodding with admiration. Even George stood, extending a professional handshake, offering a polite grin. For a moment, everything felt exactly as it should. Samuel settled into the guest chair. A production assistant clipped a microphone to his lapel. He adjusted it slightly, rolling his shoulders back. His posture was relaxed, but upright, alert. The countdown began. 5. 4. 3. The red camera light blinked on. And just like that, America was watching. George leaned forward, voice smooth and practiced. Samuel, thank you for being here this morning. Let's talk about the new film. Everyone's excited. Samuel nodded, leaning in slightly. His voice came out steady, warm, controlled. Absolutely, George. We put a lot into this one. I think audiences are really going to connect with it. So far, seamless. Robin smiled. Michael nodded approvingly. The energy felt balanced. But then something shifted. George glanced down at his cards. And instead of following up on the film, instead of asking about the role, the preparation, the story, he paused. It was brief. Almost unnoticeable. But in live television, pauses matter. He looked back up. Before we get into that, he began casually, almost conversationally, there's been a lot of discussion lately about actors your age still taking on physically demanding action roles. The air didn't change instantly. It tightened. Subtly. Samuel's expression didn't move, but his eyes sharpened just slightly. George continued. Do you ever think there's a point where it might be time to step aside and let younger talent handle those roles? It landed softly in tone, but heavily in implication. Robin's smile flickered, just for half a second. Michael shifted in his chair, adjusting his posture, sensing something that hadn't yet fully surfaced. Samuel didn't answer immediately. He inhaled slowly. His jaw flexed. "Excuse me," he said, not loudly, but clearly. George gave a small shrug. "I'm just saying, action roles are demanding. You're not exactly 25 anymore. Do you ever worry about keeping up?" The audience laughter that usually fills awkward morning TV gaps, didn't come. Silence. Not dramatic silence. Real silence. The kind that stretches thin and fragile. Robin leaned slightly forward. "George, I don't think," but he continued. "It's a fair question," George insisted lightly. "There's an entire generation coming up. Don't you think maybe it's time to make space?" Samuel's shoulders straightened. His voice lowered. Measured. Controlled. "What you're asking," he said carefully, "is whether I'm too old to do my job." George smiled thinly. "I didn't say that." "You didn't have to," Samuel replied. Michael cleared his throat softly. "Maybe we can talk about the training process for this film." "I heard you did a lot of your own," George waved a hand gently. "We'll get to that. I just think it's an interesting industry conversation." Interesting. The word hung there. Samuel leaned back now, studying George the way a chess player studies an opponent who's just made a reckless move. Inside his mind, calculations were happening. He had been in this industry longer than some of these producers had been alive. He had survived Hollywood politics, media cycles, critics, box office wars. He had earned his place. And here, on live television, he was being framed as obsolete. He felt it. Not as anger. As disrespect. The difference mattered. Robin tried again. "Samuel's career speaks for itself. He's one of the most consistent." "I'm not questioning his past," George interrupted. "I'm asking about now." That did it. Not explosive. Not dramatic. Just a quiet internal click. Samuel leaned forward slowly. The movement alone shifted the energy in the room. "Let me ask you something, George," he said softly. The softness made it sharper. "When you sit there asking these questions, do you think you're being insightful?" George blinked. "I'm being honest." "No," Samuel said calmly. "You're being dismissive." A ripple moved through the audience. Not loud. Just an uncomfortable adjustment of bodies in seats. George's posture stiffened. "I'm a journalist. Tough questions come with the territory." "Tough," Samuel repeated quietly. "Is different from disrespectful." Robin's fingers tightened around her cue cards. Michael exhaled through his nose. Somewhere off camera, a producer murmured urgently into a headset. The temperature in the studio, once warm from the lights, now felt suffocating. George leaned back slightly, crossing one leg. "If you can't handle the conversation," he said, tone sharpening just a fraction, "maybe that says something." And that was the moment. Not loud. Not chaotic. But definitive. Samuel's eyes darkened. Not with rage. With finality. He adjusted the microphone on his jacket slowly. The small metal clip made the faintest clicking sound. And everyone on that set, from the camera operators to the interns holding water bottles, felt something shift beneath their feet. Because this wasn't going the way morning television usually goes. And somewhere in the control room, someone whispered the one phrase that producers dread hearing on live broadcast: "We've lost control." Samuel leaned forward one last time. His voice, when it came, was no longer conversational. It was deliberate. "Let me explain something to you, and as he began to speak, Robin's expression tightened, Michael sat straighter, and George realized, perhaps too late, that the interview he thought he was controlling, was slipping out of his hands. The audience held their breath. The red camera light burned brighter than ever. And in that studio, under artificial sunlight and very real tension, 38 seconds had already changed everything. But what Samuel said next would make it impossible to go back. Absolutely, Abdullah. Here is part 2, the escalation, the combustion, the moment everything spirals. Tension rises slowly, then detonates. Part 2, the line that couldn't be uncrossed. Let me explain something to you. Samuel's voice wasn't loud. That's what made it dangerous. The studio felt smaller somehow, like the walls had quietly inched inward. The overhead lights still glowed with that artificial morning warmth, but now the brightness felt harsh, exposing every micro-expression, every flicker of doubt, every tightening jaw. George tried to maintain composure. His posture was upright, chin slightly lifted, the practiced confidence of a veteran anchor. But the muscle in his cheek twitched. Just once. Samuel leaned forward, elbows resting lightly on his knees. His hands were calm. Controlled. But his eyes were locked. I've been in this industry for over 3 decades, he said evenly. I've trained. I've worked. I've bled for roles. I've shown up on time, delivered performances, carried films, elevated scripts. And you're sitting there asking me if I should step aside. The audience was utterly silent now. No shifting. No whispering. Just stillness. George inhaled slowly. It's not personal. It's about the evolution of Hollywood. Samuel tilted his head slightly. Funny. It sounded personal. Robin's fingers hovered over her cue cards, but she didn't speak. She was reading the room, and the room was on edge. Michael's eyes moved between the two men like he was watching a tennis match where the ball had suddenly turned into a grenade. George leaned forward, voice tightening just slightly. Are we not allowed to discuss aging in action cinema? Is that off limits now? There it was. The subtle provocation. Samuel's jaw flexed. You're not discussing aging, he replied. You're implying expiration. A faint murmur rippled from the audience, quickly suppressed, but impossible to ignore. Behind the cameras, a floor manager mouthed something urgently toward the control room. In the booth upstairs, producers were talking over one another in hushed panic. George's fingers tapped lightly against the desk. If audiences are wondering, you don't speak for audiences, Samuel cut in smoothly. That interruption landed harder than anything before it. George blinked. Excuse me. You don't get to hide behind audiences to justify your tone. If you want to ask me something, ask it. But own it. The studio air felt thick. Even the cameras seemed hesitant, operators adjusting their framing slightly, unsure who to prioritize in the shot. Michael finally leaned in. Hey, maybe we reset. Let's talk about the stunt training for this film. I heard you did, but George wasn't backing down. I'm simply asking whether there's a time when actors should recognize their limitations. And that's when something shifted again. Not outwardly explosive. But internally decisive. Samuel leaned back slowly. He studied George for a long second, the kind of long that stretches uncomfortably on live television. Then he stood up. Not abruptly. Deliberately. The audience gasped softly. The chair legs scraped faintly against the studio floor, a small sound that echoed far louder in the silence. Robin's eyes widened. Samuel, he reached calmly to his lapel. And unclipped the microphone. The tiny metal snap of it detaching was crisp. Final. George's composure cracked just slightly. What are you doing? Samuel looked down at him. I'm making a decision. His voice carried, not shouted, but resonant. Every syllable precise. I don't sit in rooms where my presence is reduced to a talking point. George stood now too, instinctively defensive. You can't just walk off because you don't like a question. This wasn't a question, Samuel replied evenly. It was a dismissal disguised as one. Robin stood halfway, torn between professionalism and instinct. Samuel, please. We can redirect this. He turned to her, and the difference in his expression was striking. Softer. Respectful. Robin, I appreciate you. Then back to George. But I won't stay for this. The tension snapped tighter. George's voice rose now, not dramatically, but enough. If you can't handle scrutiny, Samuel's eyes flashed. Scrutiny, he repeated. Scrutiny is about work. Performance. Craft. You question my right to occupy space. Michael stood up fully now. His large frame adding physical weight to the moment. George, man, this isn't, but George cut him off. I'm not apologizing for journalism. Samuel let out a short, humorless breath. Journalism, he echoed. The word felt heavier coming from him. Journalism seeks truth. What you did was chase provocation. The control room was in chaos now. Voices overlapping. Someone whispering, cut to commercial. Someone else responding, we can't yet. The red camera light was still on. America was still watching. George's face flushed deeper. You're overreacting. That was it. The final spark. Samuel stepped closer to the desk. Not aggressively. But unmistakably. I've earned my seat at any table I choose to sit at, he said quietly. And I don't need permission from you, or anyone, to keep working. The audience, restrained until now, began clapping. Not thunderous. But supportive. It spread slowly. One row. Then another. A show of solidarity. George looked stunned. Robin closed her eyes briefly, not in disagreement with Samuel, but in dread of what this meant for the broadcast. Michael gave a subtle nod toward Samuel. Respect. George's composure fractured fully. This is my show. Samuel's eyebrow lifted. Your show, he repeated. He glanced around at the crew. The cameras. The audience. This is Good Morning America. Not the George Stephanopoulos experience. A sharp inhale swept through the room. George pointed toward the exit. If you're leaving, then leave. The hostility was no longer subtle. Samuel picked up the microphone from the chair and placed it carefully on the desk. That gesture, calm, controlled, carried more weight than any shouted word. You invited me here to talk about my work, he said. Not to question my expiration date. He turned toward the audience. And for anyone watching, the film opens next weekend. I'm proud of it. Even now, poised, unshaken. Mission accomplished. Without George. Security had quietly moved closer. To the set, not because Samuel had done anything threatening, but because tension like this on live television is unpredictable. But Samuel didn't need to be escorted. He walked on his own. Measured steps. Head high. The studio doors at the far end felt miles away. Robin finally spoke, her voice softer now. Samuel. I'm sorry. He paused near the edge of the set and looked back. Not your fault. Then he was moving again. George stood frozen behind the desk, anger mixing with something else now, something closer to realization. The audience was no longer neutral. They weren't with him. Michael leaned toward George, whispering something off mic, sharp, serious. The floor director began frantically signaling for a break. 5. 4. 3, the doors opened. Samuel stepped through. And just before they closed, his voice carried one last time into the studio. Know the difference between tough and disrespectful. The doors shut. A heavy sound. Final. The red camera light blinked off. Commercial break. But the damage wasn't contained by advertisements. The control room erupted. Producers rushed the desk. Makeup artists hesitated. Interns stood frozen. Robin removed her earpiece and walked off without looking at George. Michael followed. Leaving George alone at the anchor desk, papers scattered, expression shaken. For the first time that morning, he looked small. Outside, in the hallway beyond the studio doors, Samuel L. Jackson walked calmly toward the exit, publicist already calling, social media already exploding, headlines already forming. Inside the studio, George straightened his stack of papers with trembling fingers. The countdown to returning live had already begun. And when those cameras turned back on, he would have to face millions of viewers who had just watched him lose control. But what none of them knew yet was that the real fallout, the backlash, the divided audience, the viral clips, the network response, was only just beginning. And when the red light came back on, nothing would feel the same again. The red camera light flickered back on. The control room hummed like a hive, producers speaking over one another in urgent, clipped tones. The audience, still holding residual tension from the abrupt exit, shuffled in their seats, uncertain whether to clap, cheer, or simply remain frozen. The artificial glow of the studio lights now felt harsh, almost accusing, exposing every flaw, every uneven breath, every subtle tremor. George Stephanopoulos straightened his papers, attempting to mask the inner turmoil with the practiced poise of a morning anchor who'd faced presidents, diplomats, and high-profile celebrities. But Samuel L. Jackson's words lingered in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Know the difference between tough and disrespectful. Those words had landed, ricocheted, and now cut deeper than any public relations crisis manual could anticipate. Robin Roberts returned to her seat, shoulders tight, jaw firm, exuding a professional calm that barely concealed her disappointment. Her eyes, however, betrayed the weight of witnessing a revered actor reduce a morning broadcast into a tense confrontation with nothing but his dignity intact. Michael Strahan, arms crossed, sat like a sentinel, silent but conveying unwavering support. The dynamic on the set had shifted. The balance had tilted. George inhaled slowly, attempting to regain composure. He cleared his throat, muttered something about taking a commercial break, but his voice lacked conviction. The once familiar rhythm of the show, smooth transitions, warm chatter, predictable humor, had vanished in 38 seconds. He tried to form a smile, but it faltered, brittle against the reality of what had just occurred. Off camera, the crew scrambled. Camera operators adjusted, directors whispered frantic instructions, and producers debated whether to resume normal programming or address the audience directly about the incident. Somewhere in the control room, someone tapped the emergency broadcast log, fearing social media would erupt before the next segment even aired. And yet, the audience, a mixture of tourists, morning viewers, and early risers, was captivated. Their phones were out. Clips were already being filmed discreetly, already preparing to go viral. They had witnessed something rare, the collision of power, respect, and principle unfolding unfiltered on national television. George leaned forward once again, voice taut. "We will continue after the break." The word sounded hollow, echoing in the studio like an apology he wasn't willing to offer. Robin exchanged a glance with Michael. Their silent communication conveyed more than words could, a mix of incredulity, frustration, and a shared understanding that the morning had just deviated into uncharted territory. Meanwhile, somewhere beyond the studio doors, Samuel L. Jackson's measured steps echoed against the corridor walls. Security had retreated, the actor had maintained composure throughout, never raising his voice, never losing control. The entire walk was cinematic in itself, head held high, shoulders squared, presence commanding every inch of space he crossed. He was leaving, yes, but on his own terms, dignity unbroken, authority unquestioned. In those few seconds, Samuel had achieved more than a simple exit. He had reclaimed control. He had turned the confrontation into a lesson in professionalism, a demonstration of boundary setting, and a reminder that respect is earned, not demanded. Every eye on set, every camera recording live, had witnessed this display of integrity. Back inside, George slumped into his chair. Papers shuffled awkwardly beneath his hands. He attempted to address the audience again, voice unsteady. "Well, that was unexpected. We'll be right back with more news after the break." But the damage was already done. The network knew it. The co-hosts knew it. And the millions watching from home knew it. Robin exhaled slowly, the weight of the broadcast pressing against her chest. "You did well," she said quietly, almost to herself. She looked toward Michael. He nodded subtly, a silent acknowledgement that sometimes restraint and support speak louder than words. For George, the lesson was raw and immediate: preparation, authority, and years of experience mean nothing if they are wielded without respect. For Samuel, it was affirmation: decades of craft, countless performances, and a reputation built on excellence could not be diminished by one poorly timed question. Outside the studio, social media erupted. Clips circulated. Commentary poured in. The narrative was clear: Samuel L. Jackson had walked off live television, unflinching, uncompromising, and utterly dignified. Headlines formed within minutes, framing the story as more than a morning show mishap, a moment of celebrity asserting boundaries in real time, a cultural touchpoint that would spark debate and admiration alike. Inside, the remaining crew moved with a blend of mechanical precision and quiet awe. Cameras panned to Robin and Michael, ensuring continuity, even as every mind processed the extraordinary events that had unfolded. George tried again to regain control of the narrative, but the energy had shifted irreversibly. The studio, the cameras, the audience, all had witnessed that line drawn, that boundary enforced, that dignity defended. Samuel L. Jackson's exit was not dramatic in a cinematic, over-the-top sense. It was controlled, precise, deliberate. Every step, every motion, every glance had been intentional. The world watched, mesmerized, as the legendary actor turned a moment that could have descended into chaos into a statement of principle. His final words, firm, calm, unwavering, echoed long after the doors shut behind him: "Know the difference between tough and disrespectful." In those 9 words lay decades of experience, professionalism, and the courage to stand unflinching before disrespect. The camera crews, the audience, the network, and the millions at home had witnessed more than an interview. They had witnessed a masterclass in presence, authority, and self-respect. As the studio finally moved into the commercial break, the contrast between the actors on set and the anchor behind the desk could not have been starker. Robin Roberts removed her earpiece, walking off with quiet dignity. Michael Strahan followed, expression unbroken, posture unwavering. And George remained, papers shuffled, microphone adjusted, but the energy had shifted. Authority without respect had crumbled before his eyes. For viewers, the segment was unforgettable. For the network, it was a moment that would require careful narrative management. For Samuel L. Jackson, it was a reaffirmation of a truth he had lived by for decades: no one has the right to demean your craft, your work, or your worth. You decide where your line is, and when crossed, you have the power to stand, speak, and walk away. And as Samuel disappeared through the back exit, the sunlight from the hallway framing him like a final shot in a movie, one truth remained crystal clear: respect is earned, and sometimes, it must be defended publicly, courageously, and uncompromisingly. The camera cut to commercial, but the echo of the confrontation lingered in every corner of the studio, in every conversation on social media, in every morning conversation in households across America. The 38 seconds that George Stephanopoulos had underestimated had transformed a routine interview into a moment of cultural resonance, a vivid example of dignity over spectacle, integrity over ego. If you want to see more moments like this, the ones that reveal the real human drama behind celebrity headlines. Don't forget to hit the like button. Comment below what you think about Samuel L. Jackson's response. Was it the ultimate lesson in respect, or did he go too far? And of course, subscribe to the channel and share this video so everyone can witness the moment that shook morning television to its core. Because sometimes, watching someone stand their ground is far more entertaining than any scripted scene in Hollywood.